The anatomy of a genocide. It's been a significant while since I last posted any kind of discourse on Facebook, or anywhere else for that matter. As my last, now distant post elaborated upon, I wish to concentrate on my health with the hope of returning myself to more functionality inside a world increasingly depleted, seemingly, of the core values to which I hold dear, as do the overwhelming majority of my dear friends I have acquired over the years on this platform. I wish I could say that I feel a substantive change in my health to date. I wish too that I could say that I feel a substantive change in the values espoused by the world around me. But however dark the future sometimes appears, both within and without, I don't see that as any reason to give up. On the contrary, as long as I have a beating pulse and the capacity to fight, I will continue to hold forth the values that I believe in as a fundamental necessity for bringing light, justice and harmony into a broken and damaged world. Just as I will continue to fight for my own return to a pain-free reality of inner harmony, strength and vitality. Moreover, I firmly believe that whether those aims can or will be achieved or not should have no bearing upon the struggle to achieve them, because without that struggle, we abandon ourselves to nothing but a sea of overwhelming, fetid darkness, smothering and extinguishing all hope, all possibility of real progress, and the very essence of life and love as we know it. As the genocide in Gaza is now firmly entrenched inside its third year, we cannot and must not fall into the trap of an exhaustive silence. Nor must we fall into the trap put so craftily into place by Israel and its allies that there is any kind of real ceasefire in place, and that the Palestinians are somehow now living a brighter reality. Let us be clear, in no way has the genocide in Gaza come to an end, just as in no way has the continued ethnic cleansing, mass killing, torture and oppression of Palestinians from the West Bank and East Jerusalem abated. The only real difference now is that the world's focus has turned to other more so-called prescient matters, whilst Israel continues to slaughter and oppress with the impunity it has always had, and the Palestinians continue to suffer and die in the shadows of Western hypocrisy and complicity, with the silence of the world's elites more deafening than ever. Since this so-called ceasefire has been in place, Hamas has adhered faithfully to its obligations. It has returned all the living hostages without delay and worked to return the bodies and remains of the remaining hostages, many decimated by Israel's bombs, despite the almost impossible conditions on the ground and with no heavy equipment permitted for the task of searching under the indeterminable debris and rubble. Despite these difficulties, to date only the remains of one Israeli hostage remains unaccounted for. And yet all the while not a day has passed in which Israel has not flagrantly infringed the so-called ceasefire agreement. Not only does Israel continue to occupy more than 50% of the Gaza Strip, it has put in place an invisible yellow line whose demarcation is unknown to the wretched, traumatized and starving population, and where any Palestinian crossing it, including young children and infants, are immediately exterminated. Hundreds of Palestinians have already been annihilated in this way. In addition, Israel continues to bomb and fire at Palestinians in tents and shelters on a daily basis. True, the daily extermination of Palestinians can now be counted in handfuls rather than in their hundreds. But they are continuing to be slaughtered nonetheless, and the world powers remain utterly silent to these ongoing crimes against humanity. The annihilation of over 400 Palestinians by Israel has been officially recorded since the implementation of the so-called ceasefire, with many hundreds more injured. This ongoing genocide, however, should not be considered solely in terms of how many Palestinians Israel exterminates on a daily basis. Israel is involved in a far more effective and far more insidious way of culling and disappearing the Palestinians. And that is through the means of indirection that it has perfected over these past years. By blatantly ignoring the demands stipulated by the so-called ceasefire agreement, Israel, with absolute and merciless control over Gaza's borders, and once again with total impunity, continues to prevent the entry of tents, mobile homes and other materials necessary for the building of shelters into the decimated open-air concentration camp. Furthermore, Israel continues to prevent the entry of substantial and necessary foodstuffs and heavy machinery for clearance and reconstruction purposes. The cumulative result of all of this, after more than 2 years of sustained and forced starvation, the destruction of more than 90% of residential homes, the destruction of every hospital, the release of insane amounts of deadly pollutants into the air, the ground and the water sources, and the destruction of almost all infrastructure, sewage and sanitation facilities, speak for themselves. Those Gazans who have managed to survive the genocide to date are severely malnourished and traumatised. Their immune systems are gravely compromised, and they are thus far more susceptible to the diseases that are now rife inside the Strip. Apart from the sewage running freely through their crowded makeshift tent camps, into which hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been herded like cattle, and after having been displaced an average 6 times since October the 7th, the tents themselves, sheltering entire families, are no more than appendages of worn pieces of cloth and canvas, torn and dishevelled from more than 2 years of blistering summer heat and 3 years of wind and rain and winter storms. With no income other than those lucky enough to have received some contributions from fundraising campaigns, contributions which have now largely dried up as interest from the outside wanes. No work and no hope for an improved future. These pitiful excuses for shelter are all they have, and offer little or no protection from the cold winter nights and torrential winter rains. The results speak for themselves. In the last winter storm from just a few days ago, most of the tents were flooded, with several inches of water pouring down onto them from the skies and from the rivulets of water streaming in from all directions, turning the sandy ground beneath them into vast polluted pools of grime and sewage. These conditions, which the Palestinians have to endure, truly beg a belief, and nothing we say or write can ever begin to describe what these resolute but exhausted and traumatised people, abandoned by the world, are forced to endure on a daily basis. It should be of no surprise, therefore, that the number of Palestinians dying from disease, malnutrition and hypothermia has been increasing alarmingly. We will perhaps never know the true number of Palestinians that have been killed in this indirect way as a result of these utterly inhuman conditions being imposed upon them and the lack of medical care available to them. But experts estimate the number to be in the hundreds of thousands. Nor should we ignore the fact that the life expectancy of Palestinians in Gaza has been reduced not by years, but by decades. All of us with a conscience and a modicum of discernibility must remain alert to the injustices of Trump's and Netanyahu's imposed solution that has been thrust upon the broken Palestinian population, whilst excluding any Palestinian agency from the equation. Whilst Palestinians continue to be slaughtered and culled by Israel, the entrenched colonial mindset that envisages a building of Gaza over the years and decades, and its governance by outside forces, viz. Elites all ultimately answerable to US and Israeli demands, essentially entrenches Israel's occupation of the Palestinians, both directly and by proxy, whilst Trump tries to sweeten this grotesque formulaic plan with abstract ideas of Palestinian autonomy and statehood that Israel will never concur to. All of us with a conscience and with our discernibility intact must also be aware that this battle for justice and humanity will not and cannot be won on the battlefield, but rather on the field of conscience and morality that we must continue to extend out to the edges of our world and beyond. I say this now as 6 members of Palestine Action are fighting for their lives in UK jails after spending more than a year in prison, denied bail, charged and treated as terrorists, on hunger strike, protesting their prolonged imprisonment without trial, their harsh conditions, and the state's harassment of their families. Let us not forget that before us are the most bold and noble of individuals, willing to sacrifice their lives for the noble cause of Palestine and against the unashamed complicity of the UK government in facilitating Israel's genocide of the Palestinians. Saying they are fighting for their lives is no exaggeration. They have been on hunger strike for more than 40 days now. They have been hospitalised several times already, unable to stand as their muscles waste away, as their brains and organs begin to fail them, and as their families watch on helpless from the side. All whilst the human aberrations of Prime Minister Starmer and Justice Minister Lamy refuse to engage with them in dialogue or even acknowledge their demands. And whilst these heroic individuals cling on to life as their condition deteriorates by the hour, thousands upon thousands of British citizens, many of them pensioners, have been arrested and charged with supporting terrorism by daring to show their solidarity through peaceful demonstration, daring to hold up placards with the written words, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." When an elected government no longer represents the will and conscience of its people, when it no longer has any moral integrity, when it sides unashamedly in supporting and facilitating the actions of an apartheid state in its genocidal onslaught of its indigenous population through the supply of deadly weapons and aircraft, when it hosts Israeli firms on its territory for the manufacture and supply of killer drones used for the mass slaughter of the indigenous population, when it is covertly involved in the use of reconnaissance flights over Gaza to supply the genocidaire with intelligence to carry out its ignominious plans, when it threatens to undermine the ICC for daring to carry out its role in upholding international law, when a government is so overwhelmingly supportive of and complicit in such abhorrent crimes against humanity, then it is the obligation of its citizens to speak out and act out in defiance. For not to do so is to be complicit in the very crimes you oppose. I say this as Germany has just passed a law declaring the use of the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," to represent an act supportive of terrorism with appropriate punishment. It is the responsibility of all of us, not only to hold our principles close to our hearts, but to shout them from the rooftops, to act out and to protest the grotesque distortion of morality that is taking place today in the Western world, as complicity with Israel's crimes against humanity become ever more glaringly obvious to those with vision to see. For only when the citizens of the world can truly unite and peacefully but firmly oppose this collaboration with evil, with all available tools, only then will we be able to see justice realised, an end to the tyranny of colonialism, and the creation of a state in Palestine for all its citizens. It wouldn't be right for me to speak out now in this way without me also addressing the rise in antisemitism that is clearly manifesting throughout the world. A rise for which Israel must bear the bulk of responsibility, and which was both inevitable and predictable by all who share an understanding of how Zionism operates, how it has deliberately conflated itself with Judaism from the outset, and how it has manipulated and unashamedly weaponized anti-Semitism to serve its aims. It's been said over and over by those like myself who oppose Zionism at every level, but let me say it once again. Judaism and Zionism are two very different things, and it is not complicated by any stretch of the imagination to understand why. Judaism is a religion. It is one of the world's oldest religions and one of the three Abrahamic religions. Zionism, on the other hand, is a political ideology believing in the right of a homeland for the Jews in historical Palestine, upon the land where the Palestinian Arab population have been indigenous for thousands of years. Zionism has been around for hundreds of years. Its origins lay in Christian Zionism, whose roots came out of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, and which views the return of Jews to Zion as a necessary precursor for the coming of the second Christ and the end of days. Jewish Zionism, on the other hand, was espoused by Theodor Herzl towards the end of the 19th century, when a homeland for the Jews was posited as a way of protecting European Jews from the rising scourge of anti-Semitism. And it has given rise and evolved into the Zionism that defines Israel today. At the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, most European Jews were not Zionists. Many actively opposed it, unwilling to see their status as European Jews put at risk. More than 95% of the population of Palestine were Palestinian Arabs. Less than 5% of the Palestinians were Jews. And yet these indigenous Palestinian Arabs were not even mentioned by name in the Balfour Declaration. With British colonialism and the notions of white supremacy in full swing, Britain saw the handing over of British-mandated Palestine to the Ashkenazi Jews as a useful way of continuing its colonialisation by proxy, and thus keeping a firm hold of affairs in the Levant. In parallel, it was also seen as a way by anti-Semites in the British government of ridding the country of Jews. Thus, the establishment of a settler colonial outpost in the Levant by European Jewry was a Machiavellian scheme viewed as most beneficial to British interests and later American interests in order to maintain their influence over the Suez Canal and the Middle East in general. Opposing Zionism, that is, opposing an ethno-supremacist settler colonial ideology of occupying a foreign land, can hardly be called anti-Semitic, especially when most European Jews were opposed to such a move at the first place. Nor can the horrific and abject crimes of the Holocaust ever justify such an ideology that has led to the oppression, ethnic cleansing, incremental genocide, and now overt genocide of the indigenous population. To equate the opposition to such an ideology with anti-Semitism is simply absurd. The fact that this even has to be spelled out is absurd in itself. And yet this equation has been a cornerstone of Zionism since its inception, and especially so over the more recent decades. By working to change the definition of anti-Semitism so as to include the critique of Israel, by declaring Israel to be the Jewish state representing all world Jewry, and by conflating Zionism with Judaism at every turn, Israel has been busy convincing the world that criticism of its actions and of its ideology is de facto anti-Semitism, and the Zionist lobby has been hard at work for decades in making sure that the world adheres to these beliefs. Indeed, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has today been adopted by most Western powers and their institutions. As a result, Judaism is no longer defined as the hatred of Jews for being Jews, and this has led to the insane state of affairs where many Jews today have been thrown out of political parties, the UK's Labour Party being the example par excellence, and condemned as anti-Semites for their adherence to the moral values at the heart of their religion and their opposition to Zionism and the Jewish supremacy and apartheid reality inside Israel. To be clear, Zionism has succeeded in weaponizing anti-Semitism in order to serve its ends, whilst Israel unashamedly cozies up as bedfellows to some of the most virulent fascists and anti-Semites in Europe and beyond, who support its Islamophobic, racist and supremacist doctrines. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that whilst Israel is insisting that it speaks in the name of all Jews and that Zionism and Judaism are inseparable, and whilst this conflation is being upheld by virtually all Western nations and institutions, policed continuously by the Zionist lobby, Joe Public is today equating Judaism with the de facto Jewish supremacy inherent within Zionist ideology and its oppression, dehumanization, ethnic cleansing and genociding of the Palestinians, together with its virulent racism and hatred of Islam. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that anti-Semitism is on the ascent. This is, of course, particularly the case since October the 7th, when Israel has utterly decimated Gaza, officially slaughtered over 70,000 Palestinians there, including over 20,000 children. In reality, as mentioned, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have likely been killed both directly and indirectly by Israel's actions, whilst dramatically stepping up its ethnic cleansing and cruel oppression and torture of Palestinians in the West Bank. These are manifestly the actions of Zionism working towards its end game of a greater Israel, viz. The total Judaization of Palestine and total hegemony in the Middle East. And since Israel claims to represent all world Jewry through its words and actions, the world outside sees the Jews as responsible for this abhorrent reality. Having said this, it should be clear that I am in no way condoning the vile scourge of anti-Semitism, just as I am in no way condoning this false equation between Zionism and Judaism. Zionism is not and will never be and can never be the same as Judaism, just as anti-Semitism is not and will never be and can never be the same as anti-Semitism. Ignorantly conflating the two in tandem with Israel's wishes does not make it right, factually or morally. This is something that can never be emphasised enough, and it is our duty, the duty of all of us who believe in justice for Palestine and humanity in general, it is our duty to never tire in pointing this out. Jews are right to feel afraid under the present circumstances, and the world must continue to condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, just as all forms of discrimination and racism must be condemned. I only wish, however, that more Jews would wake up to the truth of this awful, manipulated reality and realise the deep responsibility that Israel bears in its creation. There is more I'd like to say, but this is drifting on, and so I shall at the same time bring this to a close. In doing so, however, I'd like just to speak out against the horrific massacre that took place on Bondi Beach and condemn it unequivocally for the evil anti-Semitic act that it was, regardless of who was present and their affiliations. This was a Jewish holiday celebration, and the murder of Jews there was a heinous act, irrespective of context. We can indeed, as I have emphasised, understand how such acts are more likely today in light of Israel's actions, but that doesn't make them right or defensible. And those who try to defend or diminish the abhorrent nature of such acts by claiming they are in some way warranted because the celebrations took place under the umbrella of Chabad or whatever, or because staunch Zionists or IDF supporters were present, such defenders are no friends of mine. In fact, anyone feeling that way who is reading or watching this would do best to unfriend me. Let me be clear, we are all products of our upbringing and our ignorance in one way or another. But ignorance does not justify injury or murder and never will. The best that we can do is to try our utmost to lift that veil of ignorance from others, just as I hope that others, more enlightened and wiser than myself, will try and lift the veils of ignorance, and there are many, from my own eyes. May the new year bring peace, wisdom and justice for all, and may the veils of ignorance fall from our eyes. As a postscript, just an addendum before I truly go out to pasture. This was a question I was going to ask, despite its difficulty to consider, or rather precisely because of it. The question was, is it possible to justify the events of October the 7th? I was reflecting on how to answer such a question and thinking that perhaps it was one of those difficult questions that could only be answered in retrospect, such as, if the events of October the 7th had ended up giving rise to an end to Jewish supremacy in Palestine and the creation of a Palestinian state, or to one democratic state for all from the river to the sea, then perhaps, in retrospect, one could find oneself justifying the horrific events of October the 7th. In other words, it would be a case of the ends justifying the means. In a similar way, I pictured myself being a guest on Piers Morgan after the events of October the 7th and trying to answer that infernal opening gambit of his, "Do you condemn the events of the 7th of October?" where he would end up demonising and damning anyone if they failed to answer in the affirmative, just as he damned Jeremy Corbyn on that horrendously limp interview of his. But as I came now to consider my own question, I realised just how ridiculous the question itself sounded. For I realised that it was entirely the wrong question to ask under the circumstances. The question to ask is not, can you ever justify the events of the 7th of October, but can you envisage such events not coming to the fore by a people who have been ethnically cleansed from their adjacent lands, who have been subjected to over 75 years of sustained humiliation and oppression, who have been shot at and wounded and seen their families and friends perish at the hands of Israeli weaponry year after year, and Israel's euphemistic and recurrent policy of mowing the lawn, who have been deprived of any livelihood, dignity or sense of a future inside the world's largest concentration camp? That is the only question that I find myself able to ask in the present context. And unfortunately, I find myself only able to answer in the negative. No, I find it difficult to envisage that such an uprising could not come to pass, and feel somewhat surprised that it took so long for it to do so. In other words, it is not a case of right or wrong, and to try and understand it in such terms as our Western imperialist mindset has tried to do is to completely miss the mark. It can only be understood in terms of physical necessity, in the same way as a pressure cooker will necessarily explode if the pressure inside becomes too great. You wouldn't be asking about the pressure cooker if it was right or wrong for it to explode, were the exploding pressure cooker to cause damage or harm to the people around it. All you could justifiably say, perhaps, was that it was wrong to have allowed the conditions to prevail which caused the pressure cooker to reach such a high pressure within.